The sound of the train whistle faded into the distance, leaving Margaret Holloway alone on the wooden platform of Silver Creek's dusty depot. She clutched her worn leather suitcase with white knuckles, her deep blue travel dress already gathering dust from the harsh Wyoming Territory winds. It was May 1879, and she had just traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. Margaret checked her pocket watch for what felt like the 100th time. 3 o'clock had come and gone. The depot agent had already locked up, tipping his hat apologetically before heading home for supper. "Miss, you sure I can't call someone for you?" he'd asked before leaving. She'd forced a smile. "My fiancé will be here soon, I'm certain." But as the sun drifted lower in the vast Wyoming sky, that certainty wavered. The handful of passengers who departed with her had long since dispersed, collected by family members or disappeared into the small frontier town that sprawled beyond the station. Margaret's throat tightened. 23 years old, and already a desperate woman, that's what her aunt had called her back in Boston. "A spinster in the making," she'd whispered loudly enough for Margaret to hear. After losing both parents to influenza, and facing the prospect of becoming her bitter aunt's permanent companion, answering Matthew Sinclair's advertisement had seemed like salvation. His letters had been kind, if not particularly romantic. A cattle rancher with a modest spread outside Silver Creek, who needed a wife. He described his 2-bedroom home, the growing town nearby, even mentioned the small garden plot that would be hers to tend. Margaret had imagined herself making a real home, perhaps eventually with children, far from her aunt's critical eye. Now, as shadows lengthened across the platform, doubt gnawed at her. Had she made a terrible mistake? The depot stood at the edge of town, and while she could see buildings down the dusty main street, the thought of walking there alone with her luggage, asking strangers about a man who hadn't bothered to meet her train, filled her with dread. The wind picked up, bringing the scent of sage and dust. Margaret shivered despite the warmth of the May evening. Her corset dug uncomfortably into her ribs after the long journey. She'd worn her best dress, done her chestnut hair carefully, hoping to make a good impression. Now she just felt foolish. As the sun touched the distant mountains, casting everything in golden light, Margaret fought back tears. She would give him until sundown, she decided. Then she would have to find her way to the hotel she'd noticed from the train window, if there even was room. And if her meager savings would cover it. She was calculating how many days she could afford to stay before facing the humiliation of a return journey when the sound of hoofbeats broke the silence. Margaret stood, shading her eyes against the setting sun. A lone rider approached from the direction of the open range, not the town. The figure grew larger as horse and rider came closer, silhouetted dramatically against the sunset. The horse, a magnificent chestnut, slowed from a canter to a walk as it approached the platform. The man aboard was tall, that much she could tell even before he dismounted in one fluid motion. Dust covered his clothing, denims, boots, and a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal tanned forearms. A weathered hat shadowed his face until he looked up at her, revealing features that were handsome despite evident exhaustion. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with sweat and trail dust. "Miss Holloway." His voice was deep with a slight rasp. Margaret nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. "Mr. Sinclair," she finally managed. The man shook his head and Margaret's heart sank. Not her intended after all. "Miles Sanders, madam, Matthew Sinclair's foreman." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm here now." "To collect you." "Where is Mr. Sinclair?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Miles Sanders looked away briefly, then met her eyes directly. "There's been an accident, madam. 3 days ago, Matthew was thrown from his horse while checking the north pasture. He didn't make it. The platform seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. The man Miles stepped forward quickly as if afraid she might faint. "I'm so sorry," he continued. "Everything happened so fast. By the time we found him and dealt with arrangements, I remembered about you coming today. I rode straight here, but he glanced at the setting sun. I'm late. I apologize for that." Margaret's mind raced wildly. Her fiancé was dead. The man she'd traveled across the country to marry, whose letters she'd read dozens of times, whose life she was meant to share gone before she'd even met him. "What am I to do now?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Miles Sanders replaced his hat, adjusting it nervously. "Madam, I've arranged a room for you at the Silver Creek Hotel. There's a widow there, Mrs. Abernathy, who'll look after you tonight. Tomorrow—" He hesitated. "Tomorrow we can discuss your options." Options. The word hung between them like a sentence. What options did a mail-order bride have when her groom was dead? "I see," Margaret said, drawing herself up. She would not cry in front of this stranger. "Thank you, Mr. Sanders." He nodded, then reached for her suitcase. "May I?" After her nod, he took the case easily in one hand, then offered his other arm. "The hotel's just down the street. I thought we might walk if that suits you. I'll lead Ranger here." Margaret placed her gloved hand lightly on his offered arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the dusty sleeve. "That would be fine." They walked in silence down the main street of Silver Creek. Despite her shock and grief for a man she'd never met, Margaret couldn't help noticing the frontier town around her. A far cry from Boston's cobbled streets, Silver Creek consisted primarily of wooden buildings, most only 1 or 2 stories tall. A general store, a saloon with piano music spilling out, a small church, and various other establishments lined the unpaved road. People, mostly men, stopped to stare as they passed. A mail-order bride was evidently something of an event in Silver Creek. "Just ahead," Miles said quietly, nodding toward a 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Silver Creek Hotel. He helped her up the steps and inside, where a plump, gray-haired woman immediately approached. "You must be Miss Holloway," the woman said warmly. "I'm Martha Abernathy. We've prepared a room for you, poor dear. Such terrible news about Mr. Sinclair." "Thank you," Margaret managed, suddenly exhausted by the long journey and the shocking news. Miles cleared his throat. "Mrs. Abernathy will show you to your room. I've paid for 2 weeks' board." 2 weeks? Margaret turned to him, startled. "To give you time to decide what you'd like to do," he explained. "I'll call on you tomorrow if that's acceptable. We can discuss matters then." Before she could respond, Mrs. Abernathy was ushering her up the stairs, chattering about hot water for a bath and supper in her room. Margaret glanced back to see Miles Sanders still standing in the lobby, hat in hand, watching her with an unreadable expression. The next morning, after the first real sleep she'd had in days, Margaret sat in the hotel's small dining room picking at her breakfast. Mrs. Abernathy had been kindness itself, providing not only a hot bath the night before but also lending Margaret a nightgown and promising to help freshen her travel-worn clothes. "Miss Holloway." She looked up to find Miles Sanders standing beside her table, hat in hand. He looked different in the daylight, younger than she'd first thought, perhaps around 30. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "Mr. Sanders," she acknowledged. "Would you care to join me?" He sat across from her, placing his hat on an empty chair. "Did you sleep well as could be expected?" she answered honestly. "I appreciate your arranging the accommodations." He nodded, then cleared his throat. "Miss Holloway, I came to explain the situation more fully, now that you've had time to rest." "Please do," she said, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "Matthew Sinclair was a good man," Miles began. "He built his ranch from almost nothing over the past 8 years. It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's good land with good water. He had about 60 head of cattle, some horses, and a comfortable house." Margaret listened, wondering where this was leading. Matthew had no family out here. "His parents are long dead and his only brother was killed at Gettysburg." Miles paused. "In his will, drawn up last year, he left everything to his future wife." Margaret stared at him. "His future? You mean me?" "Yes, madam. According to the lawyer, the will states that should he die before his marriage, but after arrangements were made for a bride, the property would go to that intended bride." Miles met her eyes directly. "The Circle S Ranch is legally yours, Miss Holloway." Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. "But that can't be right. We never met. We weren't married." "Nevertheless, it's what Matthew wanted. He was making preparations for your arrival right up until—" Miles trailed off. "The lawyer can explain it better than I can. I've arranged for you to meet with him this afternoon if you're feeling up to it." "I see," Margaret said, though she didn't see at all. "And what about you, Mr. Sanders, and the other ranch hands? I've been foreman at the Circle S for 5 years. There are 2 other permanent hands, Tom Wilkins and Eduardo Diaz, and we hire extra help during roundup and branding." Miles shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Holloway, I understand this is overwhelming. No one expects you to make decisions immediately. But decisions must be made," she said quietly. "Yes, madam, you have options. You could sell the ranch, return east with a tidy sum, or you could stay and run it, though that would be—" He hesitated. "Difficult for a woman alone," Margaret suggested. Miles nodded. "Ranching is hard work in the best of circumstances." Margaret took a deep breath. "Mr. Sanders, I came west to build a new life. I have nothing to return to in Boston." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "I would like to see this ranch before I make any decisions." Something like respect flickered in Miles's eyes. "I can take you out there today after your meeting with the lawyer. It's about an hour's ride." "I would appreciate that," Margaret said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Tell me about Matthew Sinclair. What kind of man was he?" Miles's expression softened. "Honest, hardworking. Not much for talking, but fair with his men and good to his animals. He was saving and planning for the future, your future together." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He fixed up the house special after your last letter, put in shelves for your books." Margaret blinked back sudden tears. She had mentioned her love of reading in her letters. "Thank you," she said softly. "I would have liked to have known him." "He would have been a good husband," Miles said, rising and collecting his hat. "I'll return at 2 o'clock to take you to the lawyer." The meeting with Hiram Foster, Silver Creek's only attorney, confirmed everything Miles had told her. Matthew Sinclair had indeed left his entire property to his intended bride. Mr. Foster, a bespectacled man with thinning hair, explained that while unusual, the will was legally binding. "Mr. Sinclair was most adamant about providing for you, Miss Holloway," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "He said a woman brave enough to travel across the country deserved security." By late afternoon, Margaret found herself riding beside Miles Sanders in a buckboard wagon, heading out of town toward what was now, incredibly, her ranch. She wore one of her simpler dresses, suitable for travel, and a borrowed bonnet to shield her face from the sun. The landscape opened up around them, vast grasslands dotted with sagebrush, rolling hills in the distance, and mountains on the horizon. The May sunshine warmed the earth, bringing out the scent of grass and wildflowers. Despite her circumstances, Margaret couldn't help but be moved by the wild beauty surrounding them. "It's breathtaking," she murmured. Miles glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his expression. "Most Eastern ladies find it desolate." "It's not that at all," Margaret said. "It's free, open, as if anything is possible." A small smile touched his lips, the first real one she'd seen. "That's how I felt when I first came west after the war." "You fought in the war?" Margaret asked. Miles nodded, his expression sobering. "Union Army, joined when I was 18. Saw things no boy should see." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. He shrugged. "It was a long time ago. Out here a man can leave the past behind, start fresh." "Is that what you did?" "Tried to," he said simply. Then, changing the subject, "We're coming up on Circle S land now. That creek marks the boundary." For the next half hour, Miles pointed out features of the ranch pastures where cattle grazed, the small but healthy herd of horses, the barn and corrals, and finally, the house itself. It was more substantial than Margaret had expected, a proper two-story structure built of sturdy logs, with glass windows and a covered porch across the front. A large oak tree provided shade for the yard, and beyond it, she could see the garden plot Matthew had mentioned in his letters, freshly turned for spring planting. "It's lovely," Margaret said, genuinely impressed. Miles helped her down from the wagon, and she noticed the two men watching curiously from the corral, presumably Tom and Eduardo, the other ranch hands. They touched their hats respectfully when Miles nodded in their direction. "I'll introduce you properly later," Miles said. "Would you like to see the house first?" Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous. This was to have been her home with Matthew. Now it was hers alone, a stranger's house filled with a dead man's possessions. Miles must have sensed her discomfort. "Take your time," he said quietly, leading her up to the porch. The interior was simple but comfortable. A large main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a solid oak table at the other. A kitchen extended from the back, and stairs led to the second floor. "Matthew's bedroom, your bedroom now, is upstairs to the left," Miles explained. "There's another bedroom across the landing. Matthew was using it for storage, but it could be fixed up proper." Margaret moved through the house slowly, taking in the details. A bookshelf beside the fireplace caught her eye, new wood, still smelling of pine. "Empty, waiting for her books." "He made that last month," Miles confirmed, following her gaze, "after you wrote about bringing your father's library." Upstairs, the bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. A patchwork quilt covered the bed, handmade but not by Matthew, surely. "Mrs. Peterson from town made that as a wedding gift," Miles explained, answering her unspoken question. "She dropped it by a week ago." Margaret touched the quilt gently. "Everyone's been so kind. Folks were looking forward to meeting you. Matthew wasn't much for socializing, but he'd started talking about church suppers and barn dances after you came." The tour continued through the rest of the house and out to the barn and corrals. Miles introduced her to Tom Wilkins, a lanky, freckled young man of about 20, and Eduardo Diaz, an older Mexican cowhand with a dignified manner. Both men were polite but clearly uncertain about the situation. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Miles suggested they should head back to town. "Unless you'd prefer to stay here tonight," he added. "Eduardo's wife, Maria, comes up from their place to cook and clean. She could help you settle in." Margaret considered it, tempted by the idea of sleeping in what was now her own home, but the thought of that first night alone in a dead man's house was too much. "I think the hotel for now," she said. "But I would like to return tomorrow if possible. There's much to learn if I'm to make an informed decision." Miles nodded, helping her back into the wagon. About that decision, Miss Holloway, there's something else you should know. Margaret looked at him questioningly. The ranch isn't without challenges. The past 2 winters were hard. Cash is tight until the fall roundup. And there's Frederick Caldwell. Who is Frederick Caldwell? Miles's expression darkened. Owns the biggest spread in the county, the Double C. Been trying to buy Matthew out for years. Wanted the water rights to Silver Creek, which runs through the northeast section of Circle S land. And Matthew refused to sell, he did. Caldwell didn't take it well. There's been trouble, cattle going missing, fences cut. Nothing we could prove was Caldwell's doing, but... You believe this man will continue to cause problems? Margaret asked. I'm certain of it, especially now with Matthew gone. Miles met her eyes. Miss Holloway, if you choose to sell, Caldwell will be the most likely buyer. He'll offer a fair price. He's not stupid enough to cheat a woman publicly. But I thought you should know the situation. Margaret considered this new information as they drove back toward town. The idea of selling to someone who had caused Matthew Sinclair trouble was distasteful. But what were her alternatives? A woman alone couldn't run a cattle ranch. Could she? Over the next week, Margaret spent most of her days at the Circle S, learning everything she could about the operation. Miles proved an excellent teacher, patient with her endless questions. He showed her the account books, explained the seasonal cycle of ranching work, and introduced her to the basics of cattle raising. Maria Diaz, Eduardo's kind-hearted wife, took Margaret under her wing, teaching her about the kitchen garden and showing her how to cook on the large cast-iron stove. Mrs. Abernathy helped her order appropriate clothing for ranch life, and several of the town's women called on her at the hotel, curious about the Eastern lady who'd inherited the Circle S. Through it all, Miles Sanders was a steady presence. He never presumed or overstepped, but he was always there when needed, answering questions, offering quiet suggestions, stepping back when she needed to think. Margaret found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, the confident way he handled the horses, his gentle manner with the new calves, the respect he showed to everyone from the bank president to Eduardo's shy children. She learned more about him in small pieces. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith. After the war, he drifted west, working on ranches across the territories before settling at the Circle S. He read books. She'd spotted volumes of Twain and Dickens in the bunkhouse and played the harmonica on quiet evenings. On her 10th day in Silver Creek, Margaret moved from the hotel to the ranch house. It was time, she decided. If she was going to make a decision about her future, she needed to truly experience life at the Circle S. That evening, after Maria had departed for the Diaz cabin a half-mile away, Margaret sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and pink. The enormity of her situation washed over her again. What was she doing here, pretending she could run a ranch? Yet the thought of selling and returning east filled her with a hollow emptiness. The sound of boots on the porch steps startled her from her thoughts. Miles stood there, hat in hand. "Excuse me, Miss Holloway. I wanted to check that you have everything you need for the night." "I'm fine, thank you, Mr. Sanders," she said, then impulsively added, "Would you care to join me? It's a beautiful sunset." After a moment's hesitation, he sat in the chair beside hers, placing his hat on his knee. They watched the changing colors in companionable silence for several minutes. "I've made my decision," Margaret said finally. Miles turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh, I'm going to stay, run the ranch." She took a deep breath. "Or try to, at least." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, certainly, but something else too. "It won't be easy." "Few worthwhile things are," she said. "I've spent this week learning, watching, asking questions. I know I have much more to learn, but I also know I don't want to leave this place." She gestured toward the vast landscape before them. "It speaks to something in me I didn't know was there." Miles nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling." After a moment, he added, "The men and I will help you, of course, if you'll have us." "I'm counting on it," Margaret admitted. "Especially you, Mr. Sanders." Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, something passed between them that neither acknowledged. "Then I'll stay," he said simply. 2 days later, Frederick Caldwell paid his first visit to the ranch. He arrived in a fancy buggy pulled by matched gray horses, dressed like an Eastern businessman despite the frontier setting. Margaret received him in the parlor, wearing one of her better dresses, but without the impractical trimmings she'd favored in Boston. "Miss Holloway," Caldwell said, bowing slightly. "A pleasure to meet you, though I regret the circumstances. Matthew Sinclair was a valued neighbor." "Thank you," Margaret replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. Miles had described Frederick Caldwell as a man in his 40s, wealthy from both cattle and mining interests, and ambitious for more. He'd been widowed for several years, and had a reputation for getting what he wanted, one way or another. "I'll come straight to the point," Caldwell said, settling into the chair opposite her. "I'd like to buy the Circle S. I'm prepared to offer a very generous price, enough for you to return east in comfort or establish yourself elsewhere out west, if you've developed a taste for frontier life." "That's very direct of you," Margaret said. "May I ask why you're so interested in this particular property?" Caldwell smiled, revealing perfect teeth. "Water rights, primarily. The Silver Creek watershed is essential for expanding my operation. Plus, it makes sense to consolidate holdings in the valley. A larger operation is more efficient." "I see. And what would happen to Mr. Sanders and the other hands?" "I would offer them positions, naturally, though I have my own foreman already." Caldwell's smile never wavered. "Miss Holloway, let's be practical. A woman alone cannot run a cattle ranch. The work is too hard, the decisions too complex, the dangers too numerous. I'm offering you a way out of an impossible situation." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Caldwell. However, I've decided to keep the ranch and run it myself." Caldwell's smile slipped. "That would be a mistake. Ranching requires experience, knowledge, which I'm acquiring daily," Margaret interrupted. "I have capable men working for me, and I'm a quick learner." "Sanders put you up to this," Caldwell said, his pleasant mask slipping further. "He's always been loyal to Sinclair to a fault. Mr. Sanders has been helpful, but the decision is entirely mine." Margaret stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Thank you for your offer, but the Circle S is not for sale." Caldwell rose slowly, his eyes hard despite his forced smile. "You'll change your mind, Miss Holloway, when winter comes, or when the work becomes too much, or when accidents start happening. You'll change your mind." Margaret's heart raced at the implied threat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Good day, Mr. Caldwell." After he'd gone, Miles found her still standing in the parlor, shaking slightly. "I heard," he said quietly. "Caldwell doesn't make idle threats." "I know," Margaret said. "But I won't be bullied into selling, either." Miles studied her face. "You're sure about this? It's not too late to reconsider." "I'm sure," Margaret said firmly. "This is my home now. I won't be driven from it." The summer passed in a blur of work and learning. Margaret threw herself into ranch life with determination that surprised even herself. She learned to ride astride, shocking Mrs. Abernathy but delighting Maria, to identify sick cattle, to manage the accounts, and even to shoot a rifle with reasonable accuracy. Miles was always there, teaching, supporting, stepping back when she needed to make her own mistakes. The rest of the hands, initially skeptical, gradually accepted her as the boss. Even Tom, the youngest, who'd been the most dubious about taking orders from a woman, came around after Margaret helped deliver a breech foal when no one else was around. Caldwell's threats proved real. Fences were cut, cattle went missing, and rumors spread in town about the Boston lady playing at ranching. But Margaret persisted, and with each challenge met, her confidence grew. She came to know the Circle as intimately every pasture, creek, and ridge. She learned to love the rhythm of ranch life, the satisfaction of work well done, the beauty of the land in changing seasons. And though she scarcely admitted it to herself, she came to love Miles Sanders. It wasn't something she had expected or sought. Indeed, she had come west to marry another man. But day by day, Miles' quiet strength, his integrity, his gentle humor, and the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice all of it wove a spell around her heart. By August, when the wildflowers painted the hills in swaths of color, and the evening air carried the first hint of fall, Margaret could no longer deny her feelings. But she kept them carefully hidden, uncertain if Miles saw her as anything more than Matthew Sinclair's intended, now his employer. The first real test of her resolve came during the summer roundup. Caldwell's men had been spotted near the north boundary, and cattle had gone missing from that pasture repeatedly. Miles wanted to confront them directly, but Margaret insisted on handling it herself. "It's too dangerous," Miles argued. "Caldwell's hands won't hesitate to threaten a woman alone." "I won't be alone," Margaret countered. "You and Tom will be with me, but I need to show Caldwell that I'm not afraid of him." Reluctantly, Miles agreed. The three of them rode to the north pasture the following morning, finding exactly what they expected: 4 of Caldwell's men driving a dozen Circle S cattle toward Double C land. "That's far enough," Margaret called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The men turned, surprise evident on their faces at the sight of a woman. Their leader, a hard-faced man with a scar across his cheek, sneered. "Well, if it isn't the lady rancher herself. Out for a morning ride, madam?" "You're on Circle S land driving Circle S cattle," Margaret said clearly. "I'm asking you to leave the cattle and get off my property." The men laughed. "And if we don't?" the scarred man asked. Margaret raised the rifle she'd been carrying across her saddle. "Then there will be trouble." She noted with satisfaction that Miles and Tom had also readied their weapons. "3 against 4 ain't great odds for you," one of the other men said. "True," came a new voice. Eduardo rode up beside them, rifle in hand. He'd been checking fence lines nearby and heard the confrontation. "But 4 against 4 is fair, no?" The scarred man glared at them all, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he spat on the ground. "Keep your scrawny cows, but this ain't over. Caldwell will have this land one way or another." "We'll see about that," Margaret replied evenly. "Now go." They watched as the men rode away, leaving the cattle behind. "You handled that well," Miles said quietly as they herded the cattle back to the main herd. "I was terrified," Margaret admitted, "didn't show it." Miles smiled at her. "That's what matters out here." Their eyes met, and something in his gaze made Margaret's heart race. For a moment, she thought he might say more, but Eduardo called a question about the cattle, breaking the moment. The confrontation with Caldwell's men proved to be a turning point. Word spread quickly about how Sinclair's widow had stood her ground, and the town's attitude toward Margaret shifted from curiosity to respect. Even Frederick Caldwell seemed to reconsider his approach, for the fence cutting and cattle rustling stopped. By September, with fall roundup approaching, Margaret had settled fully into her role as owner of the Circle S. The ranch was running smoothly, and though money remained tight, she had reason to hope the fall cattle sales would ease their financial situation. It was on a crisp September evening, with the aspen trees beginning to turn gold on the mountainsides, that everything changed. Margaret sat on the porch after supper, enjoying the cool air and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Miles approached from the direction of the bunkhouse, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Miss Holloway," he said, removing his hat. "Might I have a word?" "Of course," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair beside hers. "And please, after all these months, I think you might call me Margaret when we're not in front of the men." A slight smile touched his lips. "Margaret, then." He sat, turning his hat in his hands. "I've been offered a job, foreman position on a ranch near Cheyenne. Better pay than I make here." Margaret felt as if she'd been struck. "You're leaving?" "I haven't decided," Miles said. "I wanted to speak with you first." "The Circle S needs you," Margaret said quickly. Then, more softly, "I need you." Miles looked at her directly then, something vulnerable in his eyes. "Do you?" "As your foreman, or—" "Not just as my foreman," Margaret admitted, her heart pounding. "Miles, these past months, working beside you, learning from you, I've come to—" She faltered, uncertain how to continue. Miles reached across the space between them and took her hand gently in his. "I've been fighting my feelings since the day I rode up to that depot and found you waiting," he said quietly. "It didn't seem right, with you being Matthew's intended. And then you were my employer, and I didn't want you to think I was presuming." "You aren't presuming," Margaret said, tightening her grip on his hand. "I came west to marry a man I'd never met, hoping to build a life with him. I found that life, but with you instead." Miles moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, still holding her hand. "Margaret Holloway, I love you. I think I've loved you since I saw you standing alone on that platform, brave and beautiful and determined not to show how scared you were." Margaret touched his face gently with her free hand. "And I love you, Miles Sanders. I can't imagine this place my life without you in it." Miles leaned forward and kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Will you marry me, Margaret? Build this ranch together as partners?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married in the Silver Creek Church 2 weeks later with the entire town in attendance. Even Frederick Caldwell sent a wedding gift, a grudging acknowledgement that the Circle S would remain in strong, capable hands. As the years passed, the Circle S prospered under their joint management. Miles's knowledge of cattle and Margaret's head for business proved a powerful combination. They added to their herd, purchased additional land, and eventually built a larger house, though they kept Matthew's original homestead standing in respectful memory. Children came first, a son they named Matthew, in honor of the man who had, in his way, brought them together. Then twin daughters who inherited their mother's determination and their father's quiet strength. The Circle S became known as one of the best-run ranches in the territory, and Margaret and Miles became respected figures in the growing community. On their 10th anniversary, Miles took Margaret back to the train depot where they had first met. The town had grown around it, but the wooden platform remained much the same. "Do you ever regret it?" Miles asked, as they stood where she had waited that long-ago day. "Coming west to marry a man you never met?" Margaret shook her head, smiling up at him. "How could I regret the journey that brought me to you? I was waiting for the right man. He just rode up at sundown instead of meeting the noon train." Miles laughed and pulled her close. "I'm here now," he echoed his words from that first meeting, "and I always will be." "I know," Margaret said, leaning into his embrace as the Wyoming sun sank toward the mountains they both loved. "That's all that matters."